A racist flight attendant kicks out elderly black couples. Moments later, their granddaughter's bold response shocked everyone on the flight. The two of you need to get off this plane immediately. The flight attendant yelled through the cabin like a whip, her finger jabbing toward the elderly black couple struggling to settle into their seats. You're clearly unfit to fly. This is a safety issue. 72-year-old James Washington froze mid-motion, his cane still extended, his weathered hand gripping the seat back for balance. Beside him, his wife Dorothy, 70 years old with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, looked up with confusion and fear etched across her face. Her arthritic fingers, swollen at the knuckles, clutched a small pill organizer she'd been trying to tuck into the seat pocket. They'd been on the plane for less than 3 minutes. Ma'am? James's voice carried the careful politeness of a man who'd spent 7 decades navigating a world that judged him by his skin before anything else. I'm sorry, is there a problem with our seats? The flight attendant, Karen Mitchell, according to her name tag, crossed her arms over her crisp uniform, her face twisted with barely concealed contempt. The problem is that you look unwell. Both of you. Moving that slowly, needing assistance to board, we can't have passengers who might cause medical emergencies mid-flight. It's a liability. Dorothy's eyes widened with hurt. We're just elderly, dear. We're perfectly healthy. We have all our medications, our doctor's clearance. I don't care what paperwork you think you have, Karen interrupted, her voice loud enough that heads throughout the economy cabin turned to stare. I'm responsible for the safety of everyone on this aircraft. And I'm telling you that passengers who can barely walk down an aisle don't belong on this flight. Behind them, their 11-year-old granddaughter Amara stood in the aisle, her backpack still on her shoulders, her young face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that looked like calculation. She'd been helping her grandparents board, moving slowly and carefully because Grandpa James's hip hurt when he rushed, because Grandma Dorothy needed extra time with her balance. They were flying to Fort Benning, Georgia, a 5-hour flight from Seattle, to watch Amara's older brother Marcus graduate from Army basic training. Their first flight in over a decade, carefully planned, tickets purchased months ago with money saved from Social Security checks. Marcus had begged them to come, had sent them the graduation details with a handwritten note. Grandpa, I'm following in your footsteps. Please be there to see me take the oath like you did all those years ago. James had cried reading that letter. Had told Dorothy they'd move heaven and earth to be there for their grandson's big moment. But now, 3 minutes into boarding, a flight attendant was telling them to leave. These are our assigned seats, James said carefully, pulling the boarding passes from his shirt pocket with trembling fingers. Row 23, seats B and C. We checked in online. Everything was confirmed. Karen snatched the boarding passes from his hand, examining them with exaggerated scrutiny like she was looking for forgery. I see the seats. What I'm saying is that you're not fit to occupy them. Passengers need to be able to evacuate quickly in an emergency. Look at you, you can barely stand without that cane. And her, she gestured dismissively at Dorothy, she's moving like she might collapse any second. My grandmother has arthritis, Amara spoke up, her voice small but steady. She's not going to collapse. She just moves carefully. Karen's eyes cut to the child with irritation. Young lady, the adults are talking. Sit down and be quiet. Now, gentlemen, before you think this is just another story that doesn't affect you, let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone who served this country, really served it, with blood and sacrifice, be treated like garbage because of how they looked? Have you ever seen elderly folks, people who built America with their own hands, be dismissed and degraded for no reason except prejudice? Have you ever witnessed a child having to watch her grandparents be humiliated in public and wondered if you'd have the courage to speak up? If you believe that people who've lived 7 decades deserve respect regardless of their skin color, if you think veterans and nurses and good people shouldn't be judged by how fast they walk down an aisle, if you know that racism is something we should stand against no matter what, then you need to see what happened in the next 8 minutes on this flight. Because what this 11-year-old girl did, and what this flight attendant was about to face, will restore your faith that justice still exists. Drop a comment right now telling us where you're watching from and what time it is. Tell us if you've ever witnessed elderly people being discriminated against. Share your story, because James and Dorothy's story is about to get much worse before an 11-year-old makes it better. And if you believe that no veteran, no nurse, no elderly couple should be kicked off a plane for the crime of aging while black, hit that like button and subscribe to Hyper Racism channel. We're exposing the discrimination that people want to pretend doesn't happen anymore. James started to stand, not wanting to cause trouble, trained by a lifetime of knowing when to fight and when to retreat. His hand shook on his cane, his hip protesting as he tried to rise from the seat he'd barely settled into. James, no, Dorothy whispered, her voice breaking. Marcus is expecting us. We promised him. I know, honey, James said softly, defeat already settling over his shoulders. But if the lady says we can't fly. The lady is wrong, Amara said suddenly, her voice louder now, carrying a firmness that didn't match her 11 years. Grandpa, sit back down. Please. Amara, baby, it's okay. No, it's not okay. Amara stepped forward, positioning herself between her grandparents and the flight attendant. It's not okay at all. Karen looked down at the child with barely concealed annoyance. Little girl, I've already told you to be quiet. This is adult business. Your grandparents need to deplane. Or I'll call security to remove all three of you. On what grounds? Amara asked, and something in her tone made several nearby passengers stop their conversations and pay attention. What specifically are you citing as the reason for removal? Karen blinked, clearly not expecting to be questioned by a child. I've already explained. They're a safety risk. They can't move quickly enough in an emergency evacuation. Have you assessed their actual mobility? Amara continued, her voice steady despite the slight tremor that suggested she was terrified but pushing through it anyway. Have you asked about their medical conditions? Have you reviewed any documentation? I don't need documentation to see what's obvious. What's obvious? Amara's voice went sharp. What exactly do you see that's so obvious? The question hung in the air, and suddenly other passengers were really watching now, phones starting to come out of pockets, the atmosphere in the cabin shifting from uncomfortable observation to active attention. Karen's face flushed red. I see two elderly passengers who are clearly struggling. Who took too long to board? Who is blocking the aisle with their slowness? Who doesn't belong on this flight if they can't meet basic mobility requirements? There in their seats, a man across the aisle spoke up, white, maybe 60, wearing a VFW cap. They're not blocking anything. They're just sitting there. Sir, this doesn't concern you. The hell it doesn't, the veteran said, his voice carrying authority earned through years of service. I've been watching since they boarded. They moved slowly, but they moved fine. You're harassing them for being old. And if I'm being honest, I think that's only half the reason you're harassing them. The unspoken accusation hung in the air. Everyone in the cabin knew what he meant. Everyone could see what Karen was really responding to, not mobility concerns, but the color of the couple's skin combined with their age, their careful movements, their presence in a space Karen had decided they didn't belong. I'm the flight attendant on this aircraft, Karen said, her voice rising. I have the authority to remove passengers who pose a safety risk. And I'm telling you these passengers need to leave. Or I'm calling the captain. Then call the captain, Amara said quietly. Because we're not leaving. My grandparents paid for these seats. They have every right to be here. And unless you can cite specific federal aviation regulations that they're violating, you're discriminating based on age and race. Which is illegal. Karen stared at the 11-year-old, her mouth opening and closing, clearly shocked that a child was challenging her so directly, so knowledgeably. How dare you? I dare because my grandparents deserve better, Amara said, her voice starting to shake now, emotion breaking through her composure. They deserve respect. They deserve dignity. And they deserve to see their grandson graduate from basic training after he begged them to come. So either tell us the specific regulation they're violating, or leave them alone. The cabin had gone completely silent. Every passenger within earshot was watching, waiting to see how this confrontation would resolve. Karen's hand moved to her radio. Fine. You want the captain? You'll get the captain. And when he backs me up, all three of you are off this plane. And I'll make sure you're flagged so you never fly this airline again." She pressed the button, calling for the captain, her voice tight with anger and something that might have been embarrassment as she felt dozens of eyes judging her, dozens of phones potentially recording her. James sat very still in his seat, Dorothy's hand clutched in his, both of them looking at their granddaughter with a mixture of pride and terror. Amara had just escalated a situation that could end with all of them barred from flying, with missing Marcus's graduation, with consequences none of them could afford. But she'd also stood up for them in a way they'd been taught their whole lives was dangerous. In a way that could get black people, especially black children, hurt or worse. The radio crackled. The captain was being summoned. And in the next few minutes, everyone on that plane would learn something important about assumptions, about respect, about the difference between authority and bullying. But they didn't know that yet. Right now, they just watched as an 11-year-old girl faced down a flight attendant 3 times her age, protecting her grandparents from humiliation. And they waited to see if courage would be enough. Or if Karen Mitchell's prejudice would win, the way it had won so many times before for so many people who looked like James and Dorothy Washington. The captain's footsteps echoed from first class. The confrontation was about to reach its breaking point. And what happened next would determine whether an elderly couple made it to their grandson's graduation. Or whether they'd be escorted off this plane in shame, their tickets wasted, their promise broken, their dignity stripped away by a woman who'd decided they didn't belong. The answer was 30 seconds away. And everyone in that cabin was holding their breath. Captain Michael Stevens emerged from the cockpit, his silver hair and commander's uniform carrying the weight of 30 years in aviation. He'd heard Karen's radio call, urgent, claiming a safety situation, with passengers refusing to deplane. But as he walked into the economy cabin and saw the scene before him, his experienced eyes immediately recognized something that had nothing to do with safety. An elderly black couple sat quietly in their assigned seats, hands clasped together. A young black girl stood protectively in the aisle. Karen Mitchell, one of his senior flight attendants, stood with her arms crossed, her face flushed with what looked like self-righteous indignation. Captain Stevens had seen this before. Too many times before. James Washington had spent 50 years trying to make himself small enough, polite enough, unthreatening enough to survive in spaces where people looked at his skin and decided he was a problem before he'd even spoken. He'd learned those lessons in Vietnam, where, despite serving his country with honor, he'd returned home to a nation that still saw him as less than. He'd learned them in grocery stores and banks and doctors' offices and 1,000 other places where his presence seemed to offend people who'd never worn a uniform, never saved a life, never done a fraction of what he'd done for America. He was 72 now, his body marked by age and service, the hip that never healed right from a helicopter crash in '69, the arthritis in his hands from years of gripping weapons in jungle humidity, the cane he'd finally accepted last year when Dorothy had begged him to stop being stubborn about needing help. Dorothy Washington had her own scars, though hers were less visible. 40 years as a pediatric nurse, working double shifts in understaffed hospitals, holding babies who'd been abandoned or abused, fighting to save children that the system had already written off. She'd been spit on by parents who didn't want a black woman touching their children. She'd been passed over for promotions given to less qualified white nurses. She'd endured casual racism disguised as compliments. "You're so articulate for, you're not like others, I don't even see you as." But she'd kept showing up. Kept caring for those babies. Kept believing that her work mattered even when the world told her it didn't. Now, at 70, her hands didn't work like they used to. The arthritis made mornings painful, making simple tasks like opening medicine bottles or buttoning shirts into challenges that required patience and time. She moved carefully, not because she was frail, but because pain had taught her to be deliberate. Their granddaughter Amara was the daughter of their son Michael, a civil rights attorney who'd inherited his parents' commitment to justice but had armed himself with law degrees and courtroom experience. He'd raised Amara to know her rights, to understand that respectful didn't mean subservient, that politeness didn't require accepting abuse. Know the law, he'd told her since she was old enough to understand. Know your rights. Because people will try to take them from you, and if you don't know what you're entitled to, you can't fight back. The cabin itself was standard for domestic flights, Rows of blue fabric seats, overhead compartments stuffed with carry-ons, that particular airplane smell of recycled air and cleaning solution. Row 23 was toward the back of economy, near the bathrooms, the seats that cost less but still represented a significant expense for two people living on fixed incomes. James and Dorothy had saved for 8 months to afford these tickets. 8 months of skipping dinners out, of canceling their cable, of Dorothy doing without the compression gloves that helped her arthritis, because the tickets were more important. Because Marcus, their bright, determined grandson who'd enlisted at 18, had asked them to be there for his graduation. "I want you to see me take the oath, Grandpa," Marcus had written. "Want you to know that everything you taught me about service and honor, it stuck. I'm proud to follow in your footsteps." How could they not move heaven and earth to be there? Karen Mitchell had worked for the airline for 12 years. She'd started as a ground agent, worked her way up to flight attendant, and had developed very specific ideas about which passengers belonged in her cabin and which ones didn't. She'd mastered the art of polite discrimination, never using racial slurs, never explicitly stating her biases, but consistently targeting passengers of color with extra scrutiny, additional questions, skeptical looks. She'd removed passengers before. Always with plausible reasons: disruptive behavior, intoxication concerns, safety issues. The airline rarely questioned her judgment. She had seniority. She had a clean record. She knew how to document incidents in ways that protected her from accusations of bias. She'd looked at James and Dorothy Washington and seen easy targets. Elderly, moving slowly, but perfect candidates for removal under the guise of safety concerns. She'd done it before with other passengers and faced no consequences. She had no reason to believe this time would be different. But she hadn't counted on Amara. Captain Stevens reached the row, his eyes taking in the boarding passes still clutched in James's hand, the pill organizer Dorothy had been trying to put away, the cane carefully positioned against the seat. "Someone wants to explain what's happening here?" His voice was calm, professional, but there was an edge to it that made Karen straighten slightly. "Captain, these passengers are clearly unfit to fly," Karen began, her voice taking on that professional tone she'd perfected. "I observed significant mobility issues during boarding. In my professional judgment, they pose an evacuation risk." "Did you ask them about their mobility?" Captain Stevens interrupted. What? Did you ask them if they had any conditions that would prevent them from evacuating? Did you review any medical documentation? Did you make any actual assessment beyond watching them board?" Karen's mouth opened and closed. "Sir, I don't need to ask. I can see. You can see that they're elderly and moving carefully. That's not the same as being unable to evacuate." Captain Stevens turned to James. "Sir, do you have any medical conditions that would prevent you from exiting the aircraft in an emergency?" James shook his head. "No, sir. I move slowly because of an old injury, but I can move when I need to. We have our doctor's clearance for flying if you need to see it." "I don't need to see it," Captain Stevens said. "If you say you can evacuate, I believe you. You're in your assigned seats with valid tickets. I see no reason for you to deplane." He turned back to Karen, his expression hardening. "Ms. Mitchell, return to your duties. I'll speak with you after we're airborne." Karen's face went from flushed to pale. "Captain, I was just following protocol." "No, you weren't. You were making assumptions. There's a difference." He looked at James and Dorothy, his expression softening. "Folks, I apologize for this treatment. You're welcome on this flight. Is there anything you need to be comfortable?" Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of being believed, being respected, being treated like human beings deserving of dignity. "No, sir," James managed, his voice thick. "We're fine. Thank you." Captain Stevens nodded once, then headed back to the cockpit, leaving Karen standing in the aisle with dozens of eyes on her, her authority undermined, her discrimination exposed. But Amara noticed something in Karen's expression as the captain walked away. Not shame or remorse, but anger. The kind of anger that came from being challenged, from losing power, from public embarrassment. This wasn't over. Karen's eyes met Amara's, and the message in them was clear. You just made an enemy. The plane began to push back from the gate, the engines rumbling to life. They were finally taking off. But the confrontation that had started on the ground was about to escalate at 30,000 feet. And what Karen Mitchell did next would prove that some people doubled down on hate when they were challenged. Amara sat down in the seat across the aisle from her grandparents, her heart still hammering, her hands shaking now that the immediate crisis had passed. She'd done what her father taught her. She'd stood up. She'd known her rights. But she also knew, with the wisdom that black children learn too early, that standing up came with risks. Karen was still working this flight. Still had authority in this cabin. Still had 6 hours to make her grandparents miserable in small ways that would be harder to prove, harder to fight. Amara pulled out her phone, making sure it was charged. Just in case. Because she had a feeling this flight was far from smooth. And she was right. The flight reached cruising altitude an hour into the journey. Most passengers had settled into that mid-flight rhythm, reading, dozing, working on laptops. But Amara stayed alert, watching Karen move through the cabin during beverage service with the attention of a guard dog watching a threat. Karen's passive aggression started subtly. When she reached row 23 with the beverage cart, she'd served the rows in front of and behind the Washingtons, but somehow kept forgetting to ask James and Dorothy what they wanted to drink. "Excuse me," Dorothy said politely after watching Karen serve row 24. "Could we get some water, please?" Karen turned with theatrical surprise. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I skip you? I must have thought you'd already been served." She poured 2 cups of water with barely concealed irritation, sloshing liquid over the rim. "Try not to spill." The comment landed like a slap. Dorothy's hands shook from arthritis, not carelessness. James took both cups, his jaw tight, saying nothing. Amara watched her grandfather swallow his pride, watched her grandmother's eyes go distant with the kind of hurt that comes from being treated like a burden. 20 minutes later, Dorothy needed to use the restroom. James helped her stand, steadied her with his cane until she got her balance. It took time. The way everything took time when you were 70 with arthritis and a husband with a bad hip. They moved slowly down the aisle, Dorothy's hand on seat backs for support, James behind her, ready to catch her if she stumbled. Other passengers smiled sympathetically, one offering encouragement. "Take your time, dear." But Karen materialized from the galley, her face twisted with exaggerated concern. "Excuse me, you're blocking the aisle. Other passengers need to get through." "There's no one behind us," James said quietly, his military training keeping his voice level despite the anger building in his chest. "There might be. You're creating a safety hazard. Perhaps you should have thought about your limitations before booking a flight." Dorothy's face crumpled. She was trying to get to the bathroom, a basic human need, and this woman was making her feel like she was committing a crime. "We're moving as fast as we can," James said, still calm, still controlled, still refusing to give Karen the confrontation she seemed to want. "Well, it's not fast enough. This is exactly why I said you weren't fit to fly." Amara had been watching from her seat. She stood up, her phone already out, already recording. "Ma'am, you're harassing my grandparents for walking to the bathroom. That's disability discrimination under the Air Carrier Access Act. Would you like me to send this video to the FAA? Or would you like to let my grandmother use the restroom in peace? Have you ever watched someone target the most vulnerable people around them because they thought they could get away with it? Seen someone abuse the tiny bit of power they had because no one was holding them accountable? That's what Karen was doing, and she was about to learn that cameras change everything. Karen's face went red. "Put that phone away. You're not allowed to record crew members without permission." "Actually," Amara said calmly, keeping the phone steady, "I'm allowed to record when I'm documenting discrimination. It's legal under federal law. My mom's an attorney. She explained it to me. Want me to call her?" "Your mother is Jasmine Washington, a civil rights attorney with Morrison and Associates in Seattle. She specializes in airline discrimination cases. And she's on speed dial." Amara held up her phone. "Should I call her now? Or should you let my 70-year-old grandmother use the bathroom?" The cabin had gone quiet again. Passengers were watching, several with their own phones out now, creating multiple angles of documentation. Karen was trapped. She could back down and look weak. Or she could escalate and be caught on camera harassing an elderly woman who just needed to use the restroom. She chose to double down. I don't care who your mother is. I'm the authority on this aircraft. And I'm telling you that your grandparents are causing disruptions, making other passengers uncomfortable with their slowness. This is exactly the kind of situation I was trying to prevent by having them removed before takeoff. Making passengers uncomfortable? The veteran from earlier stood up, his VFW cap shifting as he leaned into the aisle. Lady, the only person making anyone uncomfortable is you. Let the woman use the damn bathroom. Other passengers murmured agreement. A younger woman spoke up, this is disgusting. They're just trying to use the restroom. Karen's control was slipping. She could feel it, the cabin turning against her, her authority being undermined by passengers who dared to question her judgment. All of you need to mind your own business. Her voice had gone shrill. I am responsible for safety on this aircraft, and these passengers are proving exactly why I had concerns. They can't move quickly. They're blocking aisles. They're causing problems. They're going to the bathroom, Amara said, her 11-year-old voice cutting through Karen's rising hysteria with devastating calm. That's not causing problems. That's being human. And if you can't understand that elderly people move more slowly and that's okay, then maybe you shouldn't be working with the public. The words hung in the air, a child calling out an adult's prejudice with clarity that shamed everyone listening. Karen's hand went to her radio. Captain, we have a situation in the cabin. Disruptive passengers refusing to comply with crew member instructions. James closed his eyes. Here it came. The escalation. The point where standing up for dignity became being disruptive. Where asking for basic respect became refusing to comply. He'd seen this playbook before. Had lived through it in a country that claimed to value freedom while denying it to people who looked like him. But before Captain Stevens could respond, before Karen could twist this situation into something that would get them kicked off mid-flight or arrested when they landed, Amara did something that changed everything. She pulled a card from her wallet, not her mother's business card, though she had that too. She pulled out her grandfather's military ID. Retired. United States Marine Corps. Colonel James T. Washington. And she held it up for everyone in the cabin to see. This is my grandfather, Amara said, her voice shaking now but still clear. Colonel James Washington, USMC, retired. 3 tours in Vietnam. Purple Heart recipient. Bronze Star. This man fought for this country while you were probably still in diapers. And you're harassing him for walking slowly because his hip was shattered when his helicopter was shot down over Da Nang in 1969. The cabin went dead silent. Karen stared at the ID, her face cycling through expressions too fast to track. And every veteran on that plane, and there were several, stood up. The veterans stood as one. The older man in the VFW cap, a woman in her 50s wearing an Air Force jacket, a younger man with a Marine Corps tattoo visible on his forearm, 2 others whose military bearing was unmistakable even in civilian clothes. They didn't say anything at first. They just stood, a silent wall of solidarity that transformed the cabin's energy in an instant. The veteran with the VFW cap spoke first, his voice thick with emotion. Colonel Washington, sir. Staff Sergeant Robert Chin, Army, retired. Vietnam, 68 to 70. It's an honor to share this flight with you. He saluted. Right there in the aisle, formal and precise. The other veterans followed suit. A salute that acknowledged not just rank, but sacrifice. Service. The brotherhood of people who'd worn the uniform and understood what it cost. James Washington, who'd been trying to make himself small, who'd been swallowing humiliation to avoid conflict, slowly straightened in his seat. 72 years old, hip aching, heart heavy with the exhaustion of being judged, but a Marine to his core. He returned the salute. And then, because some things never leave you, no matter how many decades pass, he stood. Pain be damned. Hip be damned. Kane dropped to the floor as decades of training overrode everything else. Semper Fi, he said, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded troops under fire. Thank you for your service. Dorothy was crying now, not from hurt but from watching her husband be seen, really seen, after a lifetime of being looked past, looked down on, looked at with suspicion. Amara held up a second card. And this is my grandmother, Dorothy Mae Washington, RN. 40 years at the Children's Hospital, Seattle. Pediatric Intensive Care Unit. She held dying babies when their parents couldn't bear to. She saved children that the system had given up on. She worked double shifts during the AIDS crisis when other nurses refused to touch those kids. My grandmother is a hero too. A woman several rows back stood up, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Washington? Dorothy Washington from Children's. Dorothy turned, confused. You saved my son, the woman said, her voice breaking. 23 years ago. He was born 3 months premature. 1 pound, 14 ounces. Every other nurse said he wouldn't make it. But you sat with him, held him, told me he was a fighter. He just graduated from medical school last month. Because of you. Dorothy's hand went to her mouth, tears flowing freely now. I remember, she whispered. Michael. Little Michael. Oh my God, he made it. He made it because you didn't give up on him. You treated my baby like he mattered when everyone else had already written him off. The woman moved into the aisle, not caring that the plane was at cruising altitude, needing to reach this woman who'd given her son life. You saved him. You saved me. They embraced in the aisle while passengers openly wept, while Karen stood frozen, while the full weight of what she tried to do came crashing down. She tried to remove a war hero and a nurse who'd dedicated their lives to serving others. Had harassed them, humiliated them, treated them like burdens to be disposed of. And she'd done it because they were black and elderly and moved slowly, and she decided that meant they didn't matter. Captain Stevens emerged from the cockpit again, having heard the commotion over the intercom. He looked at the scene, veterans standing at attention, passengers crying, James and Dorothy Washington being honored by the very people Karen had claimed they were inconveniencing. Ms. Mitchell, he said quietly, my office after we land. You're suspended pending investigation. Captain, I was just. You were discriminating against a decorated war veteran and a nurse who's saved countless lives. You did it based on their age and their race. You harassed them repeatedly despite being told to stop. And you did all of it while being recorded from multiple angles. He gestured to the phones still out, still capturing everything. You're done, Karen. You're done. Karen's face went through every emotion, anger, fear, denial, desperation. Sir, please. I've been with this airline for 12 years. I have seniority. I have a perfect record. You have 17 complaints in your file, Captain Stevens said. 17 passengers are claiming discrimination. All of them are people of color. All of them were dismissed because you knew how to document incidents to protect yourself. But this time, there are witnesses. Videos. A decorated Marine colonel and a beloved retired nurse. This time, your record speaks for itself. He turned to James and Dorothy. Colonel Washington, Mrs. Washington, on behalf of this airline, I offer my sincerest apologies. What you've experienced today is inexcusable. We'll be upgrading you to first class for the remainder of the flight. And I'll be recommending that the airline cover all your future travel as compensation. That's not necessary, James said, his voice still steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. We just want to get to Fort Benning to see our grandson graduate. That's all we ever wanted. Your grandson is graduating from Army basic training? Captain Stevens asked. Yes, sir. Private Marcus Washington. We raised him after his father, our son, died in a car accident. He's following in his grandfather's footsteps. Captain Stevens smiled, something breaking through his professional composure. Then we'll make sure you get there on time, Colonel. With full honors. You've earned that much and more. Karen was escorted to a jump seat at the rear of the plane, removed from passenger interaction, her 12-year career ending in shame and disgrace, while James and Dorothy were moved to first class to applause from every passenger who watched them pass. Amara walked beside her grandparents, her phone still recording, capturing the moment discrimination met consequence. Because sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys won. Sometimes, justice came. Sometimes, standing up mattered. And an 11-year-old girl had just proven that knowing your worth, knowing your rights and refusing to stay silent could change everything. But the story wasn't over, because what waited for them at Fort Benning would complete the circle in ways none of them could have imagined. Karen's career was destroyed, but the Washingtons' legacy was just beginning. In first class, James and Dorothy sat in seats wider and more comfortable than anything they'd experienced in decades of flying. The flight attendant serving the premium cabin, a kind woman named Patricia who'd heard everything that happened, treated them like royalty. Hot towels, full meals, constant attention to their comfort. But 3 rows behind them in the economy cabin, Karen Mitchell sat in the rear jump seat, her world collapsing around her in real time. Passengers were posting videos. #veteran harassment was already trending. Her face, her name, her cruelty captured from a dozen angles and spreading across social media like wildfire. Comments poured in, thousands of them, each one another nail in the coffin of her career. Disgusting excuse for a human being. Hope she never works again. Disrespecting a Marine? She deserves everything coming to her. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Text messages from friends who'd seen the videos. Calls from family asking if it was really her. An email from airline HR with the subject line, "Immediate suspension, report TO home base." She tried to defend herself in her mind, tried to reconstruct the narrative where she was the victim, where she'd just been doing her job, following protocol, concerned about safety. But the videos didn't lie. Her contempt was visible. Her targeting of the Washingtons is undeniable. Her continued harassment after being told to stop, caught on camera for the world to see. A passenger walked past her jump seat to use the bathroom, an older black woman who stopped and looked Karen directly in the eye. "Shame on you," the woman said quietly. "My husband served in Korea. Came home to people who spat on him for wearing his uniform. 60 years later, and you're still treating our veterans like trash. Shame on you." Karen couldn't respond. What could she say? That she didn't mean it? That she wasn't racist? The evidence was overwhelming, damning, and irrefutable. Another passenger passed, a young white man who'd been recording. "You're trending on Twitter," he said. "Thought you'd want to know. Not in a good way. Have you ever watched someone's prejudice destroy them in real time? Seen the moment when consequences catch up with hate?" That's what was happening to Karen Mitchell, and she was finally understanding that the world was watching, documenting, and refusing to let discrimination hide anymore. By the time the plane landed at Fort Benning, Karen's life as she knew it was over. The airline had issued a statement, "We do not tolerate discrimination of any kind. The employee in question has been terminated effective immediately." Terminated. Not suspended. Not under investigation. Fired. Gone. Airport police met the plane. Not to arrest James and Dorothy, as Karen had threatened hours earlier. To escort Karen off the aircraft and ban her from airline property. "This is unfair," she protested as they led her through the jetway. "I was doing my job. Those passengers were." "Were what?" one of the officers asked. "Were elderly? Were black? Are we moving slowly? None of those are crimes, ma'am. But harassment and discrimination are violations. Come with us." The passengers who'd witnessed everything deplaned behind her, many stopping to shake James and Dorothy's hands, to thank them for their service, to apologize for what they'd endured. Captain Stevens personally walked the Washingtons off the plane, ensuring they had everything they needed, that ground transportation was arranged, and that their grandson would be notified they'd arrived. "Colonel, Mrs. Washington," he said as they prepared to part ways, "I hope you know that woman's behavior doesn't represent this airline or its values. Most of us are honored to serve passengers like you." "Most," Dorothy repeated softly. "But not all." "No, ma'am," the captain admitted. "Not all. But we're working on that. And incidents like today, as terrible as they were for you, they help us identify and remove the people who don't belong in this industry." James nodded, understanding the complexity. Progress wasn't linear. Change didn't happen all at once. But each Karen Mitchell removed was one less person inflicting harm. "Thank you, Captain," James said. "For listening. For acting. For making sure we got here." They walked through the terminal toward baggage claim, Amara between them, her hand in each of theirs. "You did good, baby girl," James said to his granddaughter. "Real good." "I just did what Daddy taught me," Amara replied. "Knew my rights. Stood my ground. Didn't let them make you small." "You made us big," Dorothy said, squeezing her hand. "Made everyone see us. That takes courage we didn't know you had." Amara smiled, but it was bittersweet. "I shouldn't have had to, Grandma. You should have just been able to fly without anyone bothering you." "Should have," James agreed. "But the world isn't what it should be. It's what it is. And what it is requires people like you who won't stay quiet. Who'll stand up even when it's scary." They reached the exit, emerging into Georgia sunshine. And there, waiting in his dress uniform, stood Private Marcus Washington, their grandson, 20 years old, sharp as a tack in army greens. But he wasn't alone. His entire graduating platoon stood behind him. 40 soldiers at attention, waiting to honor the veteran who'd inspired one of their own, waiting to meet the nurse who'd saved countless lives, waiting to show James and Dorothy Washington what real respect looked like. What happened next would heal wounds that a flight attendant's hate had opened, and prove that sometimes the universe balances accounts in beautiful ways. Marcus Washington broke formation and ran to his grandparents. This soldier, who'd been trained to maintain military bearing, was unable to contain himself when he saw James and Dorothy emerge from the terminal. "Grandpa! Grandma!" He swept Dorothy into his arms first, gentle because he knew about her arthritis, then embraced James with the fierce grip of someone who'd missed them desperately. "You made it. Oh my God, you actually made it." "Of course we made it," Dorothy said, crying into his shoulder. "Did you think we'd miss this? Your grandfather flew through worse than turbulence to get here." James's voice was thick. "Wouldn't have missed it for the world, son. Not for anything." Marcus pulled back, noticing Amara. "Little sis, when did you get so grown?" He picked her up, spinning her around despite her protests that she was too old for that. "I'm 11, not a baby." But she was laughing, the stress of the flight finally releasing. "You'll always be my baby sister," Marcus said, setting her down. Then his expression shifted, became more serious. "Grandpa, I need to tell you something. My drill sergeant saw the videos." James's stomach dropped. "Videos? From the flight? They went viral. The whole base has seen them. Grandpa, everyone knows what happened. What that woman did to you and Grandma." "Oh no," Dorothy whispered. "Marcus, we didn't want this to overshadow your graduation. This is your day." "Grandma, stop." Marcus took her hand. "This doesn't overshadow anything. It makes it more meaningful. Because my drill sergeant, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, he's a Marine veteran. Served in Desert Storm. When he saw what happened to you, saw how you handled it with dignity, how Amara stood up for you, he said that's what service looks like. Not just in combat, but in everyday life. Maintaining honor under fire." He gestured to the platoon behind him, still standing at attention. He asked if he could meet you. The whole platoon wanted to meet you. They've been waiting here for 2 hours. Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, a man in his 50s with a chest full of medals and eyes that had seen combat. He saluted James with precision that came from decades of muscle memory. "Colonel Washington, sir. It's an honor. What you and your wife endured today, and how you maintained your dignity throughout, that's a lesson worth more than anything I could teach these soldiers. With your permission, I'd like my platoon to honor you at tomorrow's graduation ceremony." James looked at this man, this brother-in-arms separated by years but connected by service, and something broke open in his chest. All the humiliation from the flight, all the times he'd been made to feel small, all the accumulated weight of 72 years of discrimination, it couldn't be erased. But it could be acknowledged, honored, transformed into a teaching moment. "The honor would be mine, Sergeant," James said. The platoon came to attention as one, then rendered a salute that lasted a full 10 seconds. 40 young soldiers honoring a veteran who'd served before most of their parents were born. Dorothy watched her husband, this man who'd been told hours earlier that he didn't belong on an airplane, being recognized by the next generation of warriors. She watched him stand straighter despite his hip, watched pride replace the hurt in his eyes. Your service matters, Sergeant Rodriguez said. Then no. What happened on that flight was wrong. But how you responded, with grace, with dignity, with that little warrior granddaughter standing up for you, that showed these young soldiers what real strength looks like. Marcus put his arm around Amara. My little sister stopped them from kicking you off. She quoted federal law. She pulled out your military ID. She recorded everything. Grandpa, she fought for you the way you taught us to fight for what's right. James looked at Amara, this child who'd been terrified but brave, who'd stood between her grandparents and injustice, who'd known her worth and demanded others recognize it. Amara, he said, kneeling despite his hip's protest, you saved more than a flight today. You saved our dignity. You showed these soldiers that fighting for what's right doesn't always look like combat. Sometimes it looks like an 11-year-old with a cell phone and the courage to say, no more. I learned it from you, Grandpa, Amara said. You and Grandma. You taught me that we don't have to accept being treated badly just because someone has authority. That respect isn't automatic, it's earned. And that lady hadn't earned anything. The platoon broke formation then, young soldiers coming forward one by one to shake James and Dorothy's hands, to thank them for their service, to tell them about grandparents they'd lost or never knew, to say that seeing this moment made them understand why they'd enlisted. A young black private, maybe 19, approached with tears streaming down his face. Sir, my grandfather was a Tuskegee airman. He died when I was 8. I never got to tell him I was enlisting. But meeting you, hearing about what you survived today and still showed up, it's like getting to honor him through you. James embraced this young soldier, this stranger who carried the same legacy, the same burden, the same pride. Your grandfather would be proud, James said, of knowing his sacrifice meant something. They stood there in the terminal, this gathering of generations, while passengers walked past and stared, some recognizing them from the videos, some just seeing what looked like a military reunion. But it was more than that. It was justice in the form of respect. It was dignity restored. It was proof that Karen Mitchell's hatred had failed. Because James and Dorothy Washington were exactly where they were supposed to be, honored, celebrated, surrounded by people who saw their worth. And Karen Mitchell was exactly where she deserved to be, jobless, disgraced, her name forever attached to a moment of cruelty that the internet would never let her forget. The graduation ceremony the next day included a special recognition. Sergeant Rodriguez called James and Dorothy to the stage, told the assembled families about their service, about the flight incident, and about the grace they'd shown under pressure. These are the Americans we should aspire to be, he said to hundreds of people. Servant leaders who give everything and ask for nothing. Those who face discrimination with dignity. Who raises granddaughters brave enough to stand up to injustice. The applause lasted 5 minutes. And in a hotel room somewhere, watching the ceremony livestream on her laptop, Karen Mitchell finally understood what she'd lost. Not just a job. Not just a reputation. But the chance to be part of something honorable. She'd chosen hate. And hate had destroyed her. While love, courage, and dignity had lifted the Washingtons higher than any first-class seat ever could. 3 months after Flight 2847, the consequences for Karen Mitchell had multiplied far beyond losing her job. The airline had not only terminated her employment but had revoked her flight benefits, banned her from their aircraft, and added her to a database shared among all major carriers. She was effectively blacklisted from commercial aviation, not just as an employee, but as a passenger. Her story had been picked up by every major news outlet. Flight attendant Harris's war hero became a viral sensation, her face associated with discrimination, her name synonymous with workplace prejudice. She tried to defend herself in interviews, claiming she'd just been concerned about safety, that the situation had been taken out of context. But with 17 complaints in her file now public record, with dozens of videos from multiple angles showing her escalating harassment, her excuses fell flat. Former passengers came forward with their own stories. A black businessman who'd been questioned about his first-class ticket. A Latino family she'd separated because she claimed they were too loud. An elderly Asian couple had been forced to prove they spoke English before being them to board. The pattern was undeniable. Karen Mitchell hadn't just made one mistake, She'd built a career on small cruelties that finally got exposed when she targeted the wrong people. She'd lost her home when she couldn't make mortgage payments. Her husband had filed for divorce, unable to handle the public shame. Her adult children had distanced themselves, embarrassed by association. She'd become exactly what she deserved to become, a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, James and Dorothy Washington had become unlikely advocates. Amara's videos had garnered over 20 million views. The story of their dignified response to discrimination, combined with Amara's brave intervention, had inspired a national conversation about how elderly people and veterans were treated in public spaces. The airline had not only compensated them financially but had also hired Dorothy as a consultant to develop better training programs for recognizing and accommodating elderly passengers with mobility challenges. James had been invited to speak at military events about maintaining dignity under pressure. Have you ever wondered what happens when ordinary people refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice? When does a child's courage inspire millions? That's the power of standing up, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. Amara had become a youth advocate, speaking at schools about knowing your rights and standing up to discrimination. Her message was simple but powerful. You're never too young to demand respect. You're never too small to make a difference. The veteran who'd first stood up for them, Robert Chen, had started a foundation providing travel assistance for elderly veterans. Inspired by James and Dorothy, he'd created a network of volunteers who helped aging service members navigate airports and flights with dignity. The woman whose premature son Dorothy had saved 23 years earlier had reconnected with the Washingtons, creating a friendship that bridged decades. Her son, now Dr. Michael Chen, had established a scholarship in Dorothy's name for nursing students committed to serving underserved communities. Good had multiplied from one act of hate, transformed by people who refused to let cruelty have the last word. But the story's most important impact was quieter, more personal. James Washington, who'd spent 72 years making himself small to survive, had learned that he didn't have to shrink anymore. That his service mattered. That his dignity wasn't negotiable. Dorothy, who'd given 40 years to saving children often dismissed by society, had been reminded that her work had meaning that echoed through generations. And Amara, 11 years old, had learned the most important lesson of all, that speaking up worked. That courage mattered. That one voice, even a child's voice, could change everything. Karen Mitchell had tried to make them disappear. Instead, she'd made them unforgettable. Justice wasn't just served. It was celebrated, documented, and transformed into a movement. And somewhere, in every airport in America, flight attendants watch those videos during training. Learning what happens when you choose hate over humanity. When you target people you think are powerless. When you forget that dignity isn't determined by age or speed or skin color. Karen's face in those videos had become a warning. But James, Dorothy, and Amara's faces had become an inspiration. Proof that standing up matters. That justice is possible. That sometimes, courage comes in unexpected forms. And that the powerful don't always win. Sometimes, the righteous do. 1 year after Flight 2847, James Washington stood in his living room in Seattle, looking at a wall he and Dorothy had turned into a gallery of memories. Marcus's military graduation photo held pride of place. Beside it, a framed news article about Amara's youth advocacy work. A certificate from the airline thanking Dorothy for her consultation work. Letters from veterans who'd been inspired by their story. But in the center, James had hung something unexpected. A printout of one of Karen Mitchell's apology attempts from an interview she'd given 6 months after the incident. "Why do you keep that?" Amara asked, visiting for the weekend. She was 12 now, more confident, her voice literally being heard in schools and conferences across the country. James studied the printout, Karen's face frozen mid-interview, her expression a mixture of defensiveness and forced contrition. "Because I need to remember something important, baby girl. I need to remember that she's human too." Amara frowned. "She treated you and Grandma like garbage." "She did," James agreed. "And she deserved to lose her job. Deserved the consequences that came from her actions. But I keep this to remind myself that hate isn't born, it's taught." Somewhere along the way, Karen Mitchell learned that people who looked like us were less than. Learned that elderly people were burdens. Learned that she had the right to judge and dismiss and demean. He turned to his granddaughter. I keep it because the day I stop seeing her as human, the day I let hate for her consume me, I become what I'm fighting against. Justice doesn't mean dehumanizing the people who dehumanized us. It means holding them accountable while remembering that change is possible. Dorothy joined them, her arthritis better managed now with the treatments she'd finally been able to afford with the airline's compensation. Your grandfather's right, baby. What Karen did was wrong. But she's not the only Karen in the world. Every day, people make choices about how to treat others. Every day, someone decides whether to see humanity or just see differences. Do you think she's changed? Amara. James considered the question carefully. I think she's been forced to examine herself in ways she never did before. Whether that examination leads to genuine change or just bitter resentment, that's on her. Our job isn't to fix Karen Mitchell. Our job is to fix the systems that protected her for 12 years while she discriminated against passengers. He gestured to another frame, this one showing new airline policies implemented after the incident. Mandatory bias training. Anonymous reporting systems for discrimination. Regular audits of complaint patterns. Independent review boards. This is what matters, James said. Not destroying one person, but changing the system that allowed that person to cause harm for over a decade. Dorothy sat down, pulling Amara beside her. Baby, I want to tell you something about that day on the plane. Something I've never told anyone. Amara looked at her grandmother's face, seeing emotion there that hadn't been visible before. When Karen was telling us to leave, when she was making it clear she thought we were less than, I wanted to disappear, Dorothy admitted. Wanted to make myself so small that maybe she'd stop seeing us. I've spent 70 years doing that, shrinking so white people would feel comfortable. Moving carefully through spaces where I wasn't sure I was welcome. Apologizing for existing in places where my presence seemed to offend. Her voice broke slightly. And that day I was ready to do it again. Ready to leave quietly, to accept the humiliation, to miss Marcus's graduation rather than cause a scene. Because that's what I was taught. Don't make waves, don't stand out, don't give them reasons to hurt you worse. But then, Amara prompted. But then you stood up. Dorothy's tears were flowing now. This tiny girl, this 11-year-old baby, stood between us and that woman and said, no. Said we deserved respect. Said we belonged there. Said all the things I'd spent a lifetime being too afraid to say. She cupped Amara's face gently. You saved more than a flight, baby. You saved me from disappearing. You reminded me that I don't have to make myself small to make racists comfortable. That my worth isn't negotiable. That I belong everywhere I choose to be. James knelt beside them, his hip protesting, but his heart full. Your grandmother and I were from a generation that survived by being twice as good and half as visible. We learned to endure. But you, your generation, you're learning something different. You're learning that you don't have to endure discrimination. That you can fight it, document it, expose it, change it. But it's exhausting, Amara admitted. Every speech I give, every interview, people ask me to educate them about racism. To explain why discrimination is wrong. To prove that what happened to you was real. Sometimes I just want to be a kid. James understood. Then be a kid. You don't owe the world your trauma. You don't owe anyone explanations or education or emotional labor. What you did on that flight was extraordinary. But you don't have to keep being extraordinary every day. You get to just be Amara. But if I stop, if I'm quiet, does that mean Karen wins? Dorothy shook her head firmly. Karen already lost, baby. She lost her job, her reputation, and her comfortable life. But more importantly, she lost the argument. Because you proved that an 11-year-old with a phone and knowledge of her rights is more powerful than a bigot with a uniform. That's not something you have to keep proving. It's already proven. They sat together in that living room, 3 generations of the Washington family, looking at a wall of memories that told a story about pain and courage and transformation. I think about all the people who didn't have what we had, James said quietly. All the veterans who got kicked off planes and had no Amara to defend them. All the elderly people were dismissed and disrespected, with no one to document it. All the families who faced Karen Mitchell's and lost because they didn't have video, didn't know the law, didn't have the energy to fight. That's why the system changes matter, Dorothy added. Because now there are protections. Now there are procedures. Now there are consequences. Not perfect, never perfect, but better than before. Amara looked at the wall of memories, at the evidence of how one terrible flight had sparked so much change. Do you think racism will ever end? James and Dorothy exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that came from 50 years of marriage. No, James said honestly. Not in our lifetimes. Maybe not in yours. Racism is old, baby girl. Older than this country. Woven into our systems and institutions and hearts in ways that take generations to unweave. But, Dorothy continued, it can get better. It is getting better. Slower than we'd like, with setbacks and resistance, but better. Every Karen Mitchell who faces consequences instead of protection. Every policy that prioritizes dignity over convenience. Every child like you who learns they don't have to accept disrespect. That's progress. So what do I do? Amara asked. How do I keep fighting without burning out? James smiled. You do what your grandmother and I did. You pace yourself. You celebrate small victories. You find joy in the spaces between battles. You remember that you're not responsible for fixing everything. You're just responsible for doing what you can, when you can, in the ways that honor who you are. And you remember, Dorothy added, that you already changed the world. That flight, that moment, that choice to stand up, it rippled out in ways you can't even measure. People saw those videos and found courage. Airlines changed policies. Veterans felt seen. That's enough, baby. That's more than enough. Amara nodded, understanding settling over her like a blanket. She didn't have to be a warrior every day. She didn't have to carry the weight of ending racism on her 12-year-old shoulders. She just had to be Amara. And sometimes, when it mattered, she had to be brave. Just like her grandparents had been brave for 70+ years. Just like every person who'd ever stood up to discrimination and said, no more. The legacy of Flight 2847 wasn't just about Karen Mitchell's downfall or the Washington's vindication. It was about a 12-year-old learning that her voice had power. About an airline learning that discrimination had consequences. About a country seeing, once again, that racism wasn't a relic of the past but a present reality that required present action. And about 3 generations of Black Americans, survivors, fighters, advocates, proving that dignity was non-negotiable. That respect was a right, not a privilege. That justice, however delayed, was still worth fighting for. Karen Mitchell had tried to make them disappear. Instead, she'd made them unforgettable. And that legacy would outlive every policy, every headline, every consequence. Because some stories don't end. They just inspire the next generation to keep writing them. Better, braver, more free than the generation before. That was the real victory. Not Karen's defeat, but Amara's inheritance of a fight her grandparents had waged with grace. And her knowledge that she didn't have to wage it alone. That an entire generation was rising behind her. Armed with phones and laws and the courage to say, we belong here. We deserve respect. We will not be moved. That was the legacy of Flight 2847. And it would echo for generations to come. 5 years after Flight 2847, Amara Washington stood on a stage at the United Nations Youth Summit, now 16 years old and speaking to delegates from 180 countries about combating discrimination in public spaces. I was 11 when I watched a flight attendant try to remove my grandparents from a plane, she began, her voice steady and strong. Colonel James Washington, Marine Corps, 3 tours in Vietnam. Dorothy Washington, a pediatric nurse, has been saving children whom others have given up on. 2 people who'd given everything to this country, being told they didn't belong in their assigned seats because they were elderly and Black. Behind her, a screen showed clips from the videos that had gone viral years earlier, James and Dorothy's dignity, Amara's courage, Karen Mitchell's exposed prejudice. I pulled out my phone and recorded. I quoted federal law. I stood between them and injustice. And that moment changed my life. But more importantly, it changed systems. Policies were rewritten. Training was mandated. Accountability became real. She paused, looking out at the young faces watching her. But here's what I've learned in 5 years of advocacy. One viral video doesn't end racism. One person being fired doesn't dismantle centuries of systemic discrimination. One policy change doesn't transform hearts. Her grandparents sat in the front row, both now in their late 70s. James's hip was worse, but his pride in his granddaughter burned bright. Dorothy's arthritis had progressed, but her hands still reached out to hold James's, just as they had on that plane 5 years ago. Change is slow, Amara continued. It's exhausting. It's frustrating. But it's possible. Because every person who stands up, who refuses to stay silent, who documents injustice instead of looking away, they make it a little bit easier for the next person. They shift the culture incrementally. They prove that consequences exist. Marcus Washington, now a sergeant in the army, sat beside his grandparents, representing the legacy they'd built, service, dignity, courage passed through generations. My grandparents taught me something that day, Amara said. They taught me that you can be 70 years old and still learn that you don't have to make yourself small. That dignity isn't something you negotiate. That belonging isn't something you have to justify to people who've decided you don't deserve it. She smiled, emotion breaking through her professional composure. Grandpa James still uses a cane. Grandma Dorothy still moves carefully because of arthritis. But now, when they board a plane, flight attendants help them with respect. Not because they know who my grandparents are, but because policies changed. Because enough people stood up that airlines couldn't ignore discrimination anymore. The audience applauded, but Amara raised her hand. I want to be clear about something. What happened to my grandparents happens every day to people without cameras, without military service, without viral videos. Those people deserve justice too. That's why we can't stop at individual consequences. We have to change systems. She pulled up statistics on the screen behind her. Discrimination complaints are down 43% on that airline. Similar policies were adopted by 17 other carriers. Independent oversight boards established. Anonymous reporting systems created. This is what victory looks like, Amara said. Not perfect. Not complete. But measurably better. That's what we fight for, not perfection, but progress. Not the end of racism, but the reduction of spaces where it can flourish unchecked. The speech ended with a standing ovation. But for Amara, the real moment came after, when a young black girl approached, maybe 12 years old, the same age Amara had been on that flight. I saw what you did, the girl said shyly. On the plane. When you stood up for your grandparents. It made me think I could stand up too. So when my teacher said something racist last month, I recorded it. I showed my parents. They went to the school board. She got fired. Amara knelt, looking this girl in the eye. You did the right thing. You were brave. And you changed your school for everyone who comes after you. But I'm scared it'll happen again, the girl admitted. It might, Amara said honestly. Probably will. But now you know you can fight back. Now you know your voice matters. Now you know you're not alone. That was the real legacy of Flight 2847. Not just one flight attendant losing her job. Not just one family's vindication. But thousands of people, millions who saw those videos, learning that standing up was possible. That documentation mattered. Those consequences existed. That courage could come from unexpected places. Karen Mitchell's career ended 5 years ago. But the movement she'd accidentally sparked by targeting the wrong family continued to grow. Thank you for watching, gentlemen, the story of James, Dorothy, and Amara Washington. If you believe that veterans deserve respect regardless of how slowly they walk, if you think nurses who've saved countless lives shouldn't be harassed for having arthritis, if you believe that 11-year-old children shouldn't have to defend their grandparents from discrimination, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that racism isn't just a historical problem, it's a present reality requiring present action. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that expose injustice and celebrate those brave enough to fight it. What would you have done in James and Dorothy's shoes? Would you have left the plane quietly to avoid confrontation? Would you have stood your ground and risked escalation? What about in Amara's position? Would you have had the courage at 11 years old to challenge an adult with authority? Tell us honestly in the comments. Do you think racial discrimination and prejudice can truly end? What concrete steps do you believe need to happen to curb it? Is serving justice to individuals like Karen Mitchell enough? Or do we need deeper systemic changes in how we train employees, handle complaints, and hold institutions accountable? Can viral videos and social media documentation really create lasting change? Or do they just create temporary outrage that fades? Tell us your honest opinion, gentlemen, because these conversations are how movements sustain themselves beyond individual incidents. And if you want racism to become a thing of the past in our country and world at large, if you want to be like James and Dorothy Washington, maintaining dignity under pressure, refusing to accept disrespect, raising the next generation to stand up for justice, or if you want to be like Amara, using whatever tools you have, phones, knowledge, courage, to document and fight discrimination, then share this video and subscribe to this channel. Together, we can create a world where Karen Mitchell's behavior becomes unthinkable instead of commonplace. Together, we can build systems that protect the vulnerable instead of empowering bullies. Together, we can ensure that no veteran, no nurse, no elderly couple ever again has to fight for basic respect just to sit in a seat they paid for. James Washington served 3 tours in Vietnam. Dorothy Washington saved lives for 40 years. They earned their dignity long before Flight 2847. But they shouldn't have had to earn it. Dignity should be automatic. Respect should be the default. Justice should be guaranteed. We're not there yet. Maybe it won't be in our lifetimes. But people like the Washingtons, people like Amara, people like every passenger who stood up on that flight, they're building toward it. One documented incident at a time. One policy change at a time. One generation teaching the next that silence is complicity and courage is contagious. Karen Mitchell thought she had power because she had a uniform and authority over a cabin. But Amara Washington had something more powerful: a phone, knowledge of the law, and the absolute refusal to watch her grandparents be dehumanized. That's the lesson of Flight 2847. Not that the powerful always lose. But sometimes, the righteous win. Sometimes, documentation defeats discrimination. Sometimes, an 11-year-old changes the world. The question is, when your moment comes, when you witness injustice or experience it yourself, will you pull out your phone or look away? Will you stand up or stay seated? Will you be Amara, or will you be one of the passengers who watched in silence until others made it safe to speak? Your answer matters. Because the next James and Dorothy are out there right now. Boarding a plane. Entering a store. Navigating a world that judges them before they speak. And whether they face a Karen Mitchell or a Captain Stevens depends on whether the rest of us decide that dignity matters more than comfort. That justice matters more than convenience. That elderly veterans and retired nurses deserve respect, not because of their service, but because they're human. The choice is yours, gentlemen. Choose wisely. Choose courageously. Choose to be remembered as someone who stood up instead of someone who looked away. Because that's how legacies are built. One brave moment at a time. One documented injustice at a time. One generation refuses to accept what the previous generation endured. Until the day when no child has to be as brave as Amara was. Until discrimination becomes a relic instead of a reality. That day isn't here yet. But people like the Washingtons are building toward it. Will you help build with them? Your answer starts now.